Well, hello, scholars. This video is for the enduring principles of learning, and we're going to be focusing on principle 2 today. I'm just looking at the chart where we have our enduring principles of learning, our brief that has all 8 of them on there. So I'm going to share my screen with you quickly this morning, and we'll go over what the definition of principle 2 is. Okay, so it says language and literacy development, LLD, language and literacy development. So the focus of principle 2 is developing language and literacy across the curriculum, developing competence in the language and literacy of instruction across the curriculum. How does this look when teachers are enacting it? The teacher provides structured opportunities for students to engage in sustained reading, writing, and speaking activities and assists academic language use or literacy development by providing questioning, rephrasing, and modeling. Okay, so language is our tool there. So just think about that for a little bit. When you're looking at a teacher's practice and you see a teacher enacting a lesson, the only time you're going to say that it's language and literacy development is if you are seeing that the teacher is providing structured opportunities for students to engage in sustained writing and reading and speaking opportunities. Okay, so if they just have to fill in the blank on a worksheet, that is not language and literacy development, because they don't have a structured, engaged, large opportunity of time to read and write. If they're working in a writing center, putting a speech together, things like that, then you're probably going to be looking at language and literacy development. Okay, so this principle is very important for all learners, and it is particularly important for language learners of English. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind is that even for people like myself, I'm an Anglophone. I was raised, and English is my first language. It's my primary language. I'm bilingual, but I'm not a balanced bilingual because English is my dominant language. And sometimes people might think that people who are primary English speakers don't need language development, but actually we do. The hope is that we're continuously learning new vocabulary, learning to be, excuse me, more precise in our language as we're using language as a tool. So if I'm still learning language and I'm still developing my English skills, and I'm a primary English speaker, that means that other primary English speakers also, particularly if they're in grade school or in high school, these are actually children, even high school students, their brains are still developing. And so we all need language development. And if we are speakers of primary languages other than English, we still need to develop our own primary language too. Like, let's say that I am a Hispanophone and I am a primary speaker of Spanish, then I still need to develop my primary language literacy development, as well as also acquiring English. So the activity that's happening in the brain We know that people who are bilingual have a lot of neural activity and different connections in the brain because they're, using so much of their brain to be able to think through and use languages. Language is part of culture. And so, like in some cultures, there's no word for like I'm sorry. That's not in the culture. Not that people don't apologize, but they have a different way of thinking about it. Like maybe various indigenous nations, the idea is restitution. And so you wouldn't say, I'm sorry, your actions would show that, and that would be presumed. So language and culture are deeply tied together and they need to be developed. So I'm showing you here on this screen, this is a master's degree thesis defense that was done some years ago by Miss Sarah. And it's called Learning in the 21st Century, Community Learning Center Program at Horizon Elementary School. And I pulled this out because I felt like Sarah did such a good job in using the enduring principles of learning. She was looking at teachers' practices in this after school program, and she does a really nice job talking here about how we can understand learning. Now, there's various ways and frameworks of understanding how our brains process and how we learn. Now, as teachers, we really need to know how brains work and how our bodies influence what's happening in our brain, and what's happening in our brain influences our body. Those are tied together. So we want to know how to facilitate learning in the best way that we can. So we really have to know a lot about psychology, and we have to know a lot about social psychology too, because our bodies are involved in the way our psyche works. And then we also need to know a lot about history and about sociology, because as human beings, we're social creatures and we live in groups and we need each other. And so how we relate to the group is important as well. So Sarah here, she's talking about Lev Vygotsky. Now, you've probably heard of the zone of proximal development, and you've probably heard of Vygotsky's theories of learning and cognitive development. Okay, and so she's using that here and talking about learning. And I think she does a really good job of capturing what Lev Vygotsky talked about. He said, the best way to understand the mind is to look at how it changes. Our mind changes, and we can actually map activity on what is happening in our brain based on what kinds of neurons are clicking and such. So even though we don't know everything about the brain, and there's still much that we don't know, we are learning a lot through research. And when you look at how the mind changes, then we learn a little bit more about what happened before we learned something and what happened after it. And of course, for us as teachers, that's critical. Higher mental functionings have their origins in social activity. So if you remember, we looked at principle 4, which is challenging activities. And we said that that was a great way to put the lower order mental functioning that you need to have to do the higher within a context. So higher mental functioning, it has its origin in social activities. As human beings, we have activities and practices that we do that help to ensure our survival and the survival of the next generation. So those higher order thinking skills like Bloom's taxonomy, this is what we're talking about here. And they are mediated by tools and signs. Remember how we talked about the golden arches was a symbol, and as soon as we see that symbol, it triggers for us like hamburgers and Happy Meals and things. So tools are things like the computer. It helps us to be able to convey our thoughts. So we participate in these higher order thinking processes and practices using tools and signs. Even these letters on this screen here, those are signs. We have that letter B. It has no inherent meaning by itself, but as human beings, we put that together. And so we have to learn how to read and how to use what we're reading. Okay, so that's all about how we learn. Okay, the mind is always changing as part of a dialectical relationship with the world. The world influences the individual, and then the individual influences the world. Okay, so I learned something from touching the hot stove, and I moved the room around so that I don't touch the hot stove anymore. So that's very low level, but we do high level things too. Okay, so she's talking about how we learn. Okay, so she says, Vygotsky was talking about that learning is mediated on an interpsychological plane between a person and other people. So what you're doing and I'm doing, that's the interpersonal, interpsychological plane. We're creating meaning. Like if I share a joke with you and you don't get it, I'm misfiring on our interpsychological plane. Even though we have different bodies, we're connecting to each other, trying to make meaning. And so learning is about that too. I'm trying to connect to you right now to teach you about these principles of enduring learning. And we have to understand how the brain operates to know how that should be implemented in our practice. So she says, making connections between social interplay and learning is essential because it is through these social processes that cognitive development is stimulated and internalized. That makes sense, right? We see dad at the grill or mom at the grill, and so we're watching the social process of how a picnic's going to happen with a barbecue. And so we're like, how does that happen? And we're curious, and what's our cognitive sparks start flying, and we want to understand more, and learning is stimulated. Okay, so she's using this idea of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development here. And she says language is the tool of tools because it is the primary medium for learning. Even in this video, I'm using language as the tool to communicate with you and to instigate learning for you. You have a motivation because you have a product that you have to produce where you have to use these principles. But we're using language right now. As the teacher and doing this video, I'm doing most of the talking. So right now, you're not seeing in my practice language and literacy development. If that were the case, we'd have to see you using language and speaking and writing. Remember, speaking and writing, any kind of production, you're using language to go out. If you're intaking it, like I'm listening to you speak, and I'm reading, I'm internalizing what is coming to me. So that isn't productive until I create something with it and send it out. Okay, so learning is fundamentally shaped and defined by tools and signs that mediate it. That's right, right? If I'm learning on a computer program, it's shaping how I learn. I think about that a lot because when I was a kid, you still had the phone connected to the wall with a long cord that you could only go so far with. You didn't have Apple phones, and so you weren't reading these little, clips on Facebook or Instagram. So that kind of mediated the kind of reading that we do on screens. I didn't do any reading on screens until I was in high school, when the first time that I sat down at a computer. Okay, so tools mediate how we're learning, and language is a tool. And our language is social because I didn't come up with the language that I have. And the words and concepts that are in my language, they tell me what I can and can't think. Like if I don't have a word for something, I don't have a way to say it. I might be able to feel something. I might have a gut like reaction to something, but I might not know how to articulate it because I don't have the language for it. So a lot of times, education is about acquiring a language to help me to express what's happening to me and to be more intentional about how I respond to it rather than just reacting to something. I'm more intentional. Okay, so so she's looking at interactions, and of course, teaching is an interaction. How does the mind change as part of this interaction? Of course, teachers want to know this. We gave a pre-test and a post-test. We want the mind to have changed right there because of what we did in our teaching, which is the social interaction. And hopefully we developed higher mental functioning so that students are able to independently then produce it on their own. So the zone of proximal development, each child has an actual developmental level and a potential for development within a learning activity. The zone of proximal development is the difference between the actual development level as determined by independent problem solving and the potential. So if you move that potential too far out, they're going to get frustrated and give up. But if you put it just enough that they have to stretch a little bit, then they can reach for that and be successful if you guide those interactions. So that's what we want to do as part of fostering our learning. Okay, so let's see. This one, joint productive activity. The learning takes place as novices. Those are the learners. They're learning how to do what you already are expert on. You're the expert. Now, keep in mind that sometimes the children are experts. Okay, just because they're young doesn't mean they aren't expert at something. I often have students teach me things, even though I'm older than them. Usually, not always, but oftentimes I am. But my students often come with expertise in different areas that I don't have. And so sometimes it's me that's the novice. So nothing wrong with that. That's actually a very good thing when the learning is happening like that. Okay, so today we're focusing on the language development. Thinking takes place through the medium of language, right? If I'm quiet for a minute and just think, the noise in my head is actually language. I'm thinking through things. I know how to calm my mind down and get it to slow down, but I can be thinking and I'm actually, even though I'm not articulating words, I'm using language. So every day, the social language is what we call BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills. And those BICS are more like that's the conversational language that we use. Hi, how you doing? How's your day been? You use kind of these interactional patterns. When I was out of the United States in South America, I had to learn to say things like, may I be excused? Is there a restroom close by? I had to learn kind of like those basic interpersonal communication. Hi, I'm Brenda. I'm from the United States. So I had to learn how to do that. Now, formal academic language, that takes, if you're learning English as a second language, that can take between 5 to 7 years to develop this formal higher order thinking skills. So if you think about like the specialized language that you need in math, in science, in social studies, like the word hypothesis. You don't just walk up to people and have a conversation and say, well, this hypothesis, I mean, you might, if you are standing in line for movie tickets with a whole bunch of people in your field and you're all chemists. But generally speaking, you wouldn't use the word hypothesis unless you were in a specialized setting with this higher level, kind of more formalized, sophisticated language. So there's a particular kind of language for science. There's a particular kind of language for math and so on. So what Standard 2 is about is actually developing that CALP, the cognitive academic linguistic proficiency of this more formal language that we use. Is much more specialized and precise to a specific field, like the word adjective. Many people live their basic day shopping, going to visit the neighbors, things like that, without using the word adjective, because it's a specialized vocabulary within a particular narrative. So we need those kinds of specialized terms to be able to function in certain areas. So for example, my very first class in my very first doctoral program, there were other people in the class, other students who were doctoral students who had been in the program for much longer than I had, at least a year, sometimes 2 years. So I was brand new. First class, first day, first course of my doctoral program. And the other students and even the professor kept throwing around this term, hegemony. And so I didn't know what the word hegemony was. I didn't know what it meant. I even had to go home and practice pronouncing it in the mirror because I had never heard that word before, and they were using it almost in every sentence. They would say, well, that's hegemonic, that's a hegemony. And so I didn't know that specialized language. And so when I got home, I was looking it up and I listened to how you pronounce it and I practiced it so that I could be a participant in the conversation the next time. And as I was going on in my doctoral program, and pretty soon I shifted more from being a novice to more of an expert as I moved toward graduation. And I would hear other newcomers come in. And like, for example, if they would say Max Weber, right away I knew that they were novices because I knew they had mispronounced that sociologist's name. It's Max Weber. The W is actually a V in that case. So I knew the vocabulary. I had the CALP language for that because I had moved into expert role in that community, and I could tell who didn't have it just by how they pronounce certain words. Like if they said Foucault instead of Foucault, that was a dead giveaway that they were new. And so nothing wrong with that. Sometimes people see that as low status, but it's really about novices in a community who are just acquiring the specialized language that you need to function in that area. Another example would be engineering. My partner is a retired engineer, and sometimes when engineers start talking, it sounds like gibberish to me. I'm like, wah, wah, wah. I don't have that specialized language that that engineers have. So that's what we're talking about developing in language development. So I'm going to scroll through here, and she has different examples of what people are doing when she found the standards in their teaching practices. So she says, we already read that quote. So here she says, this is an example of language development and literacy. So standard 2, language and literacy development. So in this particular after-school program, they had an art show, Growing on My Family Tree, growing up inside of me. And she says that that was an example of an activity that promoted language and literacy development. That through guided participation with the teacher, Mrs. Harrison, and their big brother, big sister mentors, the students worked on several drafts of their stories. So do you see why that is language and literacy development? Because the students are doing this engaged large block of time where they're doing the writing and the literacy, and the teachers and the experts, in this case, the big brother, big sister mentors, were coaching and assisting, but actually the learners are doing these extended periods of reading, writing, and speaking. So in this case, they were doing a lot of writing. Maybe they did the speaking in a different section. But the point is that the students are developing this specialized language to be able to develop their stories. You can imagine that they need a lot of specialized vocabulary to get it written in a way that they can communicate it with others. So if I am the teacher there and I am we're writing a shared story together, but I'm doing most of the talking as a teacher and I'm doing most of the writing. That is not principle 2, because the students have to be the ones using the big blocks of chunks of time to do the writing, the reading, and the speaking. Does that make sense? So they are developing that. The teacher is coaching. So the teacher probably has to set it up so that they're able to be successful in those chunks of time. I know for myself, when I was teaching and I wanted the students to write in their journal on the first day of teaching 3rd grade on the west side of Salt Lake, I presume that they already knew how to write a paragraph, that they knew how to write words and sentences, and they did not. And so they started throwing their journals around the room and pencils were going, and they didn't know what to do with that block of time. So I had to regroup, and I still use this principle 2 of language and literacy development. I just had them draw what the prompt was. It was something like, what was something that you did over the summer after second grade was over, because it was our first day of third grade. And so we had to use language, and our tools were our crayons and our pencils. And that was the situation where one young lady drew a picture of herself giving me the finger. So she was clearly communicating to me, not something that was appropriate, but she was definitely using her tools and language to communicate, right? So I was trying to redirect it in a more productive, positive way. And I had to build trust with her. And over the semester and over that school year, we became very close. And eventually she graduated from college, and she has kept in touch with me over all these years. And we have a good laugh about her first day of third grade drawing a picture of herself giving me the finger. So that is literacy, principle 2, language and literacy development. Okay, so I hope that helps. And so you know to look at when you're thinking about CALPS or language and literacy development for principle 2, you got to be looking for CALPS for that higher order thinking, for that sophisticated language, that more formal, context specific language that you need to be participating in these spaces, like in history or math or science, those kind of things. And the students have to be the ones using the big blocks of time. They have to be the ones talking, writing, speaking, so reading. Okay, all right. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and hope that was helpful.